Okay, so yeah, there's actually three studies we're going to talk about today. The two Canadian longitudinal studies and the main results from them in terms of the stability of problem gambling over time, stability of at-risk gambling over time, stability of gambling over time, and then how the results of that study inform yet another longitudinal study that myself and Rachel are doing in Massachusetts, the acronym known as the MAGIC study. So let's get right to it. There's been many cross-sectional studies of both gambling and problem gambling. And there's been many small-scale longitudinal studies of problem gambling. But there's actually only been a handful of larger-scale multi-year longitudinal studies, and they all pretty much started at the same time. And part of this conference will be talking about some of these other ones. But the two I'm going to focus on are the two major Canadian longitudinal studies. First is the Leisure Lifestyle Life Cycle Project, funded by the Alberta Gambling Research Institute, ran from 2006 to 2011. Basically, we had 1,327 adults from 4 regions of Alberta, with 27% of the sample oversampled for at-risk characteristics. 4 comprehensive assessments, 22 months apart. Now, because the research team overlapped between the Leisure Lifestyle Life Cycle Project and Quincy, we actually coordinated the questionnaires. Also, the timing of the two longitudinal studies was roughly coincident, 2006-2011. So a very similar questionnaire to the other study I'll talk about, the Quincy longitudinal study. The dependent variable in the LLP was the CPGI, more specifically a score of 5 or higher on the CPGI, and a pretty good retention rate of 76.2%. Now, the other study is the Quincy longitudinal study, funded by the no longer in existence OPGRC, ran the same time period, 2006-2011. Again, about a quarter of the sample oversampled for at-risk characteristics, total sample size of 4,100, and 5 comprehensive annual assessments. So we assessed everything under the sun here, similar to the LLP. This is probably what distinguishes the two Canadian studies from most of the other longitudinal studies, the extensiveness of the assessment, everything from values to leisure activity to all sorts of mental health diagnosis to substance use to personality to IQ and everything in between. The dependent variable here was being in the problem or pathological gambling category on the problem pathological gambling measure, the PPGM, and an exceptionally high retention rate of 93.9%. 4 main research questions guided these studies: the natural stability of gambling and problem gambling over time, what variables best predict future problem gambling, what etiological model derives from these findings, and the implications of these results for the prevention of problem gambling. And I'm really just going to focus on it because of time constraints, the first 3 here. So first thing is the stability of these 4 categories. We have 4 categories: non-gamblers, recreational gamblers, at-risk gamblers, and problem gamblers. So what this shows, this is a graphic showing the stability over time of the non-gambling group. Now, again, non-gamblers are denoted by white, recreational gamblers by green, at-risk by yellow, and problem gamblers by red. And what this is, you can't see it, but there's actually 280 rows here. And if you expanded this, you would see that each of these represents the trajectory of these 280 individuals. And I've grouped their trajectories so that you can roughly see basically what's happening with these people. And for the most part, what you see is about 50% continue to be non-gamblers throughout 5 years. So that's this group. All these 140-odd people continue to be non-gamblers, no participation in any form of gambling in the past 12 months, and consistent through that time period. But almost as common was the fact that a lot of these people transitioned into recreational gamblers. Now, all that needed to consist of is buying the occasional lottery ticket or raffle ticket, any form of gambling just once, suddenly you're in the recreational gambler category. But you notice for most of those people, they actually transition back to non-gamblers in the subsequent year. So each of these is year. This is year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5. And so for the most part, what we say about this group is it's moderately stable. Most non-gamblers continue to be non-gamblers, but at least half of them transition to recreational gambling. Most of those transition back. Very uncommon transition to at-risk denoted by yellow, or problem gamblers. Only 1% being problem gamblers. This is stability of recreational gamblers over time. Again, recreational gambling denoted by green. As you can see, this is actually quite a stable category. That 70% of this entire group, and this is the largest group by far, there's actually 2,700 individual rows here across 5 years. And the large majority of these people continue to be recreational gamblers in every single year. 13% transitioned into non-gambling, and 10% transitioned into the yellow there, at-risk gambling, and 5% transitioned into problem gambling at some point. At-risk gambling. So at-risk gamblers are the yellow, and as you see here, this is a fairly unstable category. There's 481 people who met criteria for at-risk gambling in time 1, and 1 year is the modal duration. Only 7% of these people continue to be at risk for 5 consecutive years. That makes theoretical sense. I mean, if you're at risk, it's sort of a transitional stage. So you expect movement into problem gambling or, going back to recreational gambling. So it's supposed to be a transitional stage. But the interesting thing is that most at-risk gamblers actually transition back to recreational gambling. And so we've sort of rethought about whether at-risk is the appropriate descriptor for this category. It's true, 15% of people at risk became problem gamblers, but the large majority went back to recreational gambling. So this is probably better described as subclinical problem gambling as opposed to at-risk gambling. Nonetheless, an important result. Then, of most interest to most people is the stability of problem gambling over time. And what we have here, this is an assessment 1, everyone who was a problem gambler and then followed through. And now for this particular chart, we also added people who became problem gamblers for the first time in assessment 2, or assessment 3, assessment 4, assessment 5, just to see whether the pattern for these guys was similar. And for the most part, it is. So essentially, we're seeing a similar level of instability that we found for the at-risk people. That 1 year is the modal duration, occurring in about 51% of people. Only 19% of people continue to be problem gamblers throughout. This is not a chronic entity, at least from what we found here. So the upshot of that is that recovery rates are very high, but also relapse rates are very high. So these are all the people who recovered, but you see there's significant relapse over the subsequent 3 years, the same sort of thing occurring here. So we have 40% relapse within 3 years after recovery. Presumably, the longer-term relapse rates are going to be even higher. Now, the PPGM also has a pathological gambling category. It's problem gambling that is characterized by an especially large number of problems and especially impaired control over gambling. And essentially what we find here is that the darker red is pathological gambling, the ordinary red is the problem gambling, and that essentially this is a somewhat more chronic form than we saw with the problem gamblers. That now we have 64% have durations between 2 and 5 years. But still, only 30% were disordered gamblers, either problem pathological throughout the 5 years. So moderately unstable, but definitely more chronic than problem gambling. Recovery rates similarly are lower than problem gamblers. Fewer people recovered. And when they did recover, you can see the relapse rates are actually higher. So those are very important findings. This is from the Quinty specifically. Now, the next section is looking at the predictors of problem gambling. And we're doing this 2 ways. One is looking at univariate predictors, and the second is looking at multivariate predictors. And the way in which we looked for univariate predictors, examining the strength and consistency of variables as predictors of future problem gambling status across equivalent time periods. So we have 4 different time 1 to time 2 1-year intervals, 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to 4, 4 to 5. So we looked at predictors that were consistent in that 1-year time span across those 4 time periods. We had periods of 1 to 3, 2 to 4, 3 to 5. We're looking at predictors for 2 years. We're looking at predictors of 3 years. And we're looking for the consistency of those predictors across those equivalent time spans. And then we're looking for the same sort of consistency across both the Quinty data set and the LLP data set. We're really looking for robust predictors. Essentially, no single variable was overwhelmingly present in all future problem gamblers and absent in non-future problem gamblers. Rather, there was a smorgasbord of different variables involved, each increasing risk to some extent and present to different degrees in future problem gamblers. But there were certain variables within certain categories that were more predictive. And gambling-related variables is the category most robustly predictive of future problem gambling. This has been found in the other longitudinal studies as well, and it's fairly commonsensical, but it's worth pointing out that being an at-risk or a problem gambler is the single best predictor of being a future problem gambler, either continuity from the existing time period to the next, or that recovery and then relapse later. Intensity of gambling involvement is the second best predictor, as measured by number of formats, time spent, frequency, and/or expenditure. Higher involvement in continuous forms, electronic gambling machines in particular, but also instant lotteries and casino table game involvement was a significant and very robust predictor of future problem gambling. And there were several other strong predictors, big win in the past year. These studies are actually the first studies that we know of that's actually, even though anecdotally, problem gamblers have been telling us for a long time that big wins is what got them into problem gambling in the first place. This is actually the first longitudinal study to document and to verify that in a prospective way. Gambling being identified as a top leisure pursuit, friends or family being regular or problem gamblers, your motivation for gambling being to escape or to win money as opposed to entertainment, fun, recreation, having higher levels of gambling fallacies, being involved in internet gambling, and proximity to EGM venues. Personality, after the gambling-related variable category, personality was the next strongest category. Impulsivity in particular. We used the NEO personality inventory, so we assessed all attributes of personality and looked at what showed up. And impulsivity was overwhelmingly the strongest predictor. It's the strongest personality predictor, one of the strongest predictors across all categories. Other fairly strong personality predictors, vulnerability to stress, lower agreeableness, lower conscientiousness. That might seem like a strange triad, but it's actually the same sort of thing that shows up in predictors of future alcohol abuse. And so I don't really understand what's going on there, but it was reassuring to see that this is actually the same personality characteristics that predict other addictions. Mental health is the next most important category, predictive of future problem gambling. Depression, the strongest predictor within this category, but there were several others that were also predictive. Anxiety-related disorders, generalized anxiety, PTSD, I think OCD, but I can't remember. So substance abuse, having a behavioral addiction, shopping, sex, exercise, any of those was predictive, and a lifetime history of mental health problems or addiction to drugs or alcohol. And then there was a smorgasbord of other things in various other categories. More stressful events in the past year was predictive. Having a lower IQ, this is the first study that actually looked at IQ and future onset of problem gambling, and we found there was a significant relationship there. Weaker than the other things I've talked about up to now, but significant nonetheless. Lower educational attainment, lower happiness, higher stress, history of child abuse, antisocial traits, physical disability, and/or poor physical health. For the most part, a lot of the usual suspects, and basically that's one of the upshots of this presentation. It is a biopsychosocial etiology, and all these things contribute to different extents. But at least we understand the relative importance of these variables now. So many of these univariate predictors, educational attainment, IQ, but there's lots of other things, they have overlapping predictive power because they're measuring basically the same attribute. And so it's equally important to know doing a multivariate approach. In this case, we used logistic regression because we had a binary dependent variable, problem gambling or non-problem gambling, so we used stepwise binary logistic regression, throwing all of these things into the model to see what things actually survived. And being at risk of problem gambler, again, was by far and away the strongest predictor. It was basically these same gambling-related variables that we saw before. But there were a handful of non-gambling-related variables that were robustly added, independent, additive predictive power beyond those gambling-related variables. And here we go with impulsivity again, having a behavioral addiction, lifetime history of addiction to drugs or alcohol, family history of mental health problems. Now, when you're predicting future problem gambling, there's three groups in that group. people who become problem gamblers for the very first time, we describe as first onset problem gamblers, people who are problem gamblers from the current episode and simply continuing to the next one, and people who've recovered from problem gambling and have relapsed. And so it's important to know whether these variables differentially predict first onset, continuation versus relapse. So we did subsequent analyses to try and disentangle that. And for the most part, almost all the gambling-related variables were predictive of first onset problem gambling. The exceptions to that being proximity to EGM venues. This helps explain this convoluted and complex and often weak relationship between gambling availability and problem gambling, that it was a very important predictor of relapse, but a relatively weak, statistically significant, but relatively weak predictor of first onset problem gambling. Several personality, mental health, stress-related, cognitive, and physical health variables also implicated in first onset problem gambling, but the insight here is that in general, these variables are much stronger predictors of relapse and continuation than first onset. So, to my mind, the fog's starting to clear about the relative roles of these different variables in problem gambling. Then the other thing we looked at is proximal predictors, things that predict problem gambling in the next assessment versus problem gambling years down the road. And most predictors were found to create risk for problem gambling at all future time periods, not just ones that had, imminent risk and ones that had distant risk. That being said, when you looked at the data, there were certain variables that routinely, virtually always preceded problem gambling, and intensive gambling involvement was it. Other strong, consistent predictors, having a big win past year, impulsivity, depression. We also asked, everyone who became a problem gambler in the Quinty study had an open-ended question posed to them, what caused your problem gambling? Then we looked at what they said caused it versus the empirical predictors for the study. And essentially, there was very weak overlap, that most problem gamblers identified a singular cause where the empirical results indicated many variables, and that people tended to focus on psychological, motivational, I'm stressed out, divorce, boredom, and there was less awareness of the contextual factors, the fact they played EGMs, the fact they have a family history of problem gambling, and those more general contextual factors. And so you can actually argue that lack of insight may in fact be a risk factor for problem gambling. So our etiological model is essentially a biopsychosocial etiology, multiple risk and predictor factors. The particular pattern differs between individuals, but there are certain pathways that are a little more common than others. That heavy gambling is the final common pathway, heavy levels of gambling expenditure, frequency, time, number of formats, almost immediately precedes problem gambling in a large majority of cases. Problem gambling is also common, as multiple problem gambling episode duration is only a year. Relapse is also common, with the mental health problems and past history being the strongest predictor there. Won't go over this in detail, but this is a visual depiction of our understanding from the Canadian longitudinal studies in terms of how these things interrelate to each other. And for more information, those reports that were released in 2015 on those studies. Now, this is a jumping off point for the MAGIC, funded by the Massachusetts Gaming Commission, with Rachel, myself, and Ed Stanek being the PIs, Amanda Hout in the audience being the project manager, Martha Zorn being the data manager. This started in 2013. We have a sample of 3,100 Massachusetts adults. Now, in this case, 53% over sample for at-risk characteristics. In this case, at-risk constituted being a current problem gambler or at-risk expending more than $1,200 annually, gambling weekly, or military service, which turned out to be a unique risk factor in Massachusetts. Annual assessments in 2014, 2015, so we're actually just about to start a third wave already. These are largely self-administered in wave 1, wave 2, and they were, the first two waves were really, it was a add-on to our baseline population survey. It really wasn't intended to be a longitudinal etiological cohort. And so beginning this wave, we've expanded the questionnaire quite substantially to pick up basically all of the variables that all the other longitudinal studies have identified as being etiologically important. The dependent variable is similar to the Quinty and the problem or pathological gambler on the PPGM. The major advantages that MAGIC has over prior longitudinal studies is that there are no prior longitudinal studies of gambling in the United States. There's also a much more dramatic change in gambling availability in Massachusetts during the period of this study. We got 5 new casinos. Massachusetts hasn't had casinos up till now, and now they're introducing 4 really large ones. And so we'll be able to better establish the relative importance of sudden gambling availability. And our prior experience of doing longitudinal research allows us to better understand the sort of weaknesses of the prior longitudinal studies. And so one thing that's problematic in all the studies is we didn't have enough people who became problem gamblers. We had a few hundred, and that allowed us to say what we did. But now we realize that we need as many people to become problem gamblers as possible. And so we have 53% of our sample is oversampled for high-risk characteristics. And with more robust and efficient questionnaire, focus on the variables that all the other studies have shown to be important. And then we'll use some of our lessons from the good retention we got in LLP and Quincy for here. And furthermore, it's synergistic with our coincidental SIGMA, social and economic impacts of gambling in Massachusetts. We'll be able to correlate the findings from these 2 things, and so they really are synergistic. And for anyone interested in more information about MAGIC, there's the website. Thank you.
Questions from the audience, please.
You showed us some of the univariate and multivariate predictors for first onset and continuation and relapse. Did you also look at predictors for recovery?
No. Well, indirectly, in the subsequent analysis, again, we looked at what things predicted continuation versus what things predicted relapse, and versus what things predicted first onset. And so by identifying the things that predicted relapse, which is the mental health variables, we sort of indirectly implied that good mental health and lack of substance use was predictive of continued recovery, but not directly. It actually merits a study in and of itself. We wrote it was a 350-page report for the Quincy study. That 94% retention rate's unprecedented in large-scale longitudinal studies, especially when you're studying something as something like problem gambling, where these people are inherently transient and difficult to track. And so there's no one thing that produced this, but we have a 350-page report that identified the scientific principles involved here. And I've given, in fact, I was in Australia a few years ago, given an entire workshop on the elements that contributed to that. But bottom line, there's no magic solution to this. It's 1,000 little things, having a small, coherent, hierarchical team, and everyone being involved in all aspects of the project, having 360 type of critique. And so everyone on the project could critique what I did, and I vice versa, but also having hierarchical decision-making power, and being vigilant to all the complaints, concerns of our sample, and responding to them, and also doing very sophisticated analysis of attrition and response rates. And so does giving an email solicitation followed by a personalized postcard within 1 week produce better than the other way around? And what days of the week do most people do the survey? So we found counterintuitively, we thought that sending it, their invitation on Friday would be best because they have the weekend. But people don't do this stuff on the weekend. They're actually more likely to do it during the week, and so Mondays is a better time to solicit. And then we looked at the optimal time frame. How many days do you need before you should remind them? And what's the format? Should it be a telephone call, another email? And so we did very, very sophisticated analysis to fine-tune this over the years, and it culminated in that report. Yep. So one of the very surprising findings of the Canadian studies is that gender was not predictive of problem gambling. It flies in the face It's the most robust correlate of problem gambling we know, and yet it didn't predict greater risk of problem gambling. Now, it may well be it's because it's not male gender, it's the fact that males have higher rates of impulsivity and more likely involved in certain forms of gambling. Maybe maleness is taken out when these other variables are significant. So that was a bit of a surprise to us. We had ethnicity. Both Alberta and our Ontario doesn't have large non-Caucasian populations, so we basically had to look at it Caucasian, non-Caucasian, and being non-Caucasian was predictive, but it was actually fairly weak. It was actually, in fact, didn't make this list. It was more, I mean, we do a lot of research on the impacts of casinos on natives as well. And, you know, when you actually put casinos in the backyards of reservations in the United States, for the most part, you actually don't increase problem gambling rates. In many cases, you actually decrease it. It's not being native. It's actually the socioeconomic disadvantages, the stress, the unemployment, and when you have financial windfall, it produces better social impacts, and people are more inoculated. So we didn't have a large enough sample to really disentangle the ethnicity thing, but we were surprised to find it was a relatively weak predictor in and of itself.
Thank you very much.